Sharon, if I could start going back to, one of the things we're talking about is how churches and pandemics work and have been working over the last 6 months. If we could go back to when the pandemic shut down so many aspects of our life, including worship, literally millions of churches began broadcasting worship online, either pre-recorded or live, and people have done a great job in all sorts of adjusting to technology and finding new inclusive ways. But however, a telling element of this from the Christian church was the frequent presentation of heteronormative nuclear families at worship. So worship presented to us often from the home, the living room of mum and dad and 2.5 kids. That's how the worship event was staged. So it's a phenomenon that continues to occur and raises all sorts of questions. And I wonder, Sharon, what would you say is at stake when our gaze is turned again and again to this normative image of the family and the family as worship?
Thanks, Janice. I first started thinking about this because I had a kind of one of those moments where I was watching colleagues, and I mean, I do really want to say, as someone who has been in congregational ministry but isn't now, that I really admire how hard everybody's worked and acknowledge it's been a get up to speed really, really quickly environment. But I did have this moment a couple of weeks into the pandemic where I just thought, oh, thank goodness I'm not leading worship, because I don't have, I just didn't have what I was seeing on screen. Even if it was a single, an individual person on screen, there was a huge acknowledgement that, they had a tech, their partner was doing their tech support and their lighting, and often coming in providing music and all of this, and their kids were lighting candles or leading prayers or doing things. And I just thought, what the hell would I do if it was me on my own sim? And I know lots of people, single people, have managed it, or people have chosen, even when they're partners, to do that. But I do think we've moved really, really quickly into worshipping either directly in people's homes or creating home-like environments in sanctuaries often. And I think that does change the dynamic of worship. And I think it does and one of the things about a crisis is we have to move really, really quickly. So we move quickly and we just grab what's at hand, which, for most of us is, particularly in this pandemic where our movement was really limited, unlike some other crises where you could be out and about and engaging with more people. We've had to just, in those early do it with what we have, that's our families often, or our households. And I think for me, the question is not that we've done that, but how do we ask critical, honest questions about what's happening? How do we actually pause and say, when we do that, what's being presented? When we do that, what image of church are we doing? When we do that, who's getting power? Who's being excluded? Who doesn't see themselves represented? So interestingly, I found it much easier to worship when I've listened through a podcast or just to a voice, so that I'm not having to engage with a dynamic that just doesn't feel like I've actually got a space anymore as a sole parent, as a person who's single, and I've needed that to be in a space that blocks out those distractions. So I guess I'm inviting us to really think, how well do we know our history? We tend to think the nuclear family is, the Christian family par excellence. But, it's really clear that this kind of current model of nuclear family is a very new model. It's amongst the most worshipped things in some branches of the church. So, there's no, and it's a branch of the church I partly grew up in, there's no higher achievement than to establish your Christian family. Mm-hmm. And I mean, not to say I want families to be unchristian, but I think we really need to ask ourselves, what are we doing for older people? What do we do for people who are, because I think it's interesting, there are lots of queer families in church, but they're not the ones I'm seeing on screen. And I suspect that's a protective thing. That says to me they don't yet feel safe enough to broadcast their family. And that says to me we've still got a lot of work to do about inclusion of queer families. So, there's all those questions around is this actually, like the pandemic's done for so many things, is this showing us a crack? I think it's probably more than a crack, it's probably a seismic gaping hole. But it really says to me, we've got a long way to go till we view a diverse range of living arrangements, a diverse range of families as fully part of the Christian community.
It does. I mean, it is interesting. I noticed a comment here already about the way the nuclear family becomes an object of idolization in the church itself. And, you said before, churches love families. I've never, ever heard anyone say, we're really trying to grow our older single element of it's always young families. We really want to attract young families. So the language is there, but I wonder also, Sharon, if you'd speak to the theological ideas, because our primary metaphor of how the church relates to God is a heteronormative nuclear family, the bride and the groom, the mother and the father. So the language and the symbolism on performance in Zoom also deep in our theology, isn't it?
It's deep in our theology, but I think what's happening is it's now being interpreted in that particular, it's reinforcing or strengthening. After some years, I think of some kinds of stones being thrown at that edifice.
Yeah.
I worry that it's going to lead us to go back to deepening that theology more, to emphasising that part of the theology more. I think there are lots of images of belonging to the church. You're right, the bride and groom is a really key one, but there's also notions of the body. And what do we do if we talked about the body rather than the family? So for me, that's the question. What bit of theology are we resurfacing? Why do we default to that all the time? And that's what I think things like pandemics do. They show us actually where our default points are. So it's reminding us that the work we've done, I think, around LGBTIQ inclusion is still quite shallow. And it's bound to be, as you say, we've got these really, really, really deep images. I think Colleen mentioned already that the image of family in the New Testament's not entirely on a nuclear family, although, as you say, bride and groom, it looked different in the time when the New Testament, ideas are very, very, very different.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. When we have that image and we put that together with this contemporary expression of family, it draws out and reinforces a particular notion of belonging, a particular notion of what is a good family, what's a successful family, what's a Christian family. That's really unhelpful, and it buys back into, it makes it much harder to recover some of those other New Testament images about belonging and being and so on. And I think it also it privileges certain types of households. I've been thinking a lot about house churches as well, because there's a lot of movement now that we haven't been in our churches. We're all keen to divest. I think until we get back in them, then that'll die off. But people saying, "Oh, the early church, didn't have buildings; it met in houses." But I realise I'm really reluctant to rush to that as well, even to the notion of house church in our early theology. I think we've got to really ask really key questions about when you meet in someone's house, what happens to the power dynamics?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Paul described and talked about people whose houses churches met in. He didn't tell us anything much about the power dynamics going on there. So when you meet in someone's house, did that give them more power than the people who were coming? It's clear. You get a little hint of it in the Corinthian narrative about the workers coming and not having eaten and the food all being gone. And already there is a power dynamic emerging between those who, perhaps the head of that house who hosted the church and who was meeting and eating because they had leisure, and people who didn't have leisure came later and there was nothing.
And
So,
as you
go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say, as you say, you make the point about of course, marriage and family meant something very different in the ancient world, and so did property ownership. So there's much stronger power lines around being the owner of private property. This idea of private property in our current social models. So it is problematic.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll talk about this in other ways too, but the effect the pandemic's having on women's domestic work. So there's a lot of evidence that men think they're doing a lot of learning at home, but actually it appears they're not.
Yeah.
So if we rush out of this into, say, house churches, who's tidying the house? That's what I want to know. Yeah,
absolutely. And the domestic is political. It is a part of these conversations. I noticed numerous comments. One earlier on, and following on about queering the family, using some of the tactics of people like Marcella Outhouse-Reid of speaking obscenities to our theology. And also, again, this comment of not rushing in to these, let's all return to house churches anachronistically, as if we can simply. I want to ask a follow-up question, another tricky question to the idea of the performative worshipping family. Sharon, you're currently the Resource Development Minister within the Culture and Safety Unit of the Uniting Church in the Victorian and Tasmanian Synod, that's right?
Yep, that's right.
Yes. So what kind of questions does children's participation in this performance of a digitally stamped forever and ever online worship event raise? I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
I have to say, this is one of the things that's really, really troubles me. Like sometimes lie awake at night troubles me about some of this space. And there are two aspects. One is around the safety of children. So like it or not, we're okay with this online space, but let me tell you who really knows and understands online spaces and have done for some years, abusers of children. That is really just the truth, that most abuse of children, a lot of abuse of children happens, physically in a space, but a heck of a lot of abuse of children now is happening online. Mm-hmm. And often it'll be, the body of one child with the face of another child, such that you might never know that your child's body is being used in an online abuse space. People are very clever at manipulating quite innocent images, innocent video into making child pornography. And I think we've been just a little bit naive, more than a little bit, actually naive about that. And I do worry about what is happening to a lot of the material that's put online and then left online. And I think we need to reflecting critically about what we're putting online, what we're leaving online, how we're leaving it online, and who's in that video. So I think we have to pay attention to that. I think, it's always tricky talking about children's safety in a feminist space, because for too long we've made that the work of women, and the work of caring for children is everybody's work. But I think it's an area that feminists have given a really strong lead in, and I hope we need to continue to do that, to be really concerned for our children that can't speak for themselves. The other thing I keep wondering about, and it's more than just online worship, it's a question every parent has to wrestle with in this day, is what kind of digital legacy we're leaving our children. So the question of consent's a really interesting one for me. To what extent do these children consent fully? Do they understand what they're consenting to when they get asked to be involved in online worship? So, when you're 8 or 9, helping mum and dad out at church probably seems like a really cool thing to do, or at least more cool than the online learning lesson your very boring teachers set for you, or it may be. Particularly if your mum and dad are creative and energetic, and lots of our ministers are all of those things, and they create fantastic opportunities, and who wouldn't want to be involved in that great activity. But I wonder how you're going to feel about that online thing you did, when you're 12 or 13 or 15 or 18, when you're at university and, you know, you're going through your
rebellious nihilist stage.
Yeah, you know, you're a nihilist or a Trotskyite or a Stalinist or some atheistic right-wing monarchist. I don't know.
So many options.
I know. One of my daughters was very keen on the Queen for a while, and I always thought that was her little bit of rebellion. I just think there's some really key questions here, particularly, again, because the online worship, we're not asking critical questions yet, I don't think, fully about how long it's on for. Do we come back in a year or so and say to the children, everybody involved, are you still happy with this? Mm-hmm. I think academics really give a good lead in this. They're much more savvy about asking when something's recorded. Why are you recording it? Who's getting it? How long is it going to be up for? Is this going to, you know, affect the intellectual copyright I have over all my over this work I'm doing? And I think we've got to really be able to ask kids, give kids that right to regularly review that. So I really think, and as I say, it's not a new issue. It's an issue every parent has to think about. You know, how often do I post pictures of my kids? What pictures do I post?
Right.
But I think it becomes a really different question again, because we can lock, you know, we can control to some extent privacy of our social media. But if my child is in an online worship setting that's streamed, what happens when their employer finds that in 10 years' time?
Absolutely. And I think you've, as you said, it's a question for any parent or guardian around how they're going to negotiate, even talking about their children, like even divulging private information about people that can't consent to that. But there's another layer to this, is that they're performing a particular religious observance, and that's being added to the digital landscape. And we've been terrible, let's be honest, in the church in asking children and negotiating with children around language of consent to their participation.
But it's really, I mean, if the Royal Commission taught us anything, and it's taught us a lot, I hope, and we're learning slowly, but the right of children to have really clear voice, to be able to give consent, not just once, but constantly and regularly. And I think that's one of the things with children is you can't assume consent they gave it, or their parents gave at 5 or 6 or 8, you know, and by 5 or 6, it's starting to be a negotiated thing where they can say no to things. Their parents are begging them to do it. I think consent, because children's cognitive capacity, their emotional maturity, all of that's growing and changing even more rapidly than adults. And there are things I've consented to as an adult I wish I could take back.
Yeah.
But it's even more so for children. But I suspect we never go back in a year and say, look, this is all on our website, or this is all on our YouTube. Are you still happy for this to be here, or do you want us to edit that out?
That is excellent advice, like really great advice. And, you know, start early, do it often.
Yeah.
Start early.
If we got into that habit in this online space, I think it would really enhance everything we do with everybody. It would train us not to accept, not to just go with, oh, they signed the permission form, 10 years ago, I'm going to still keep putting their photos up. Even for adults.
There's a number of comments online starting from some thoughts expressed by Claire around the idea of we're losing this ability to be reflective practitioners. And of course, we've got to give a bit of grace in a crisis, an unprecedented, as we say, crisis, but still I think that's a really wise insight to a lot of, we're moving ahead, jumping into pragmatic solutions, and very rarely giving the time to theologically reflect about the steps we've already made and how we feel about that and how we're going to move forward.
And I think to be willing to say, even if we thought this was going to be on the World Wide Web forever, actually it's not going to be now. We've taken that time to reflect, and we realize we don't want that we realize that doesn't match as fully as we would have liked who we hope to be as this particular Christian community in this time and place. So that's the thing that probably also I think we need to do, is to be willing to say, well, that was fine, that was okay, we did our best, you know, on 3 days' notice, but actually it should always have been temporary, and we're now going to make it temporary.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Maybe I'm just going to turn tracks a little bit, change the topic a little bit, because we're thinking across the age spectrum. So if I could move to predominantly younger adults, but also all of us, can affect people at any age post-adulthood, to some of the issues happening across tertiary and education sectors. Again, rapid changes happening, perhaps with not very good reflective practices inside the church and outside. So recent moves to increase university fees for the humanities, I'm sure many of us have seen that, disproportionately affect women. And just to say to everyone, we'll be sending out a link of resources, articles, books, and research into everything we're talking about today. So we will send out some research on this, but we know that these moves disproportionately affect women. And then further, more recent announcements about cutting funding to students who fail 4 of their first 8 courses. We know that this will wildly affect Indigenous students, students from core communities, students with a disability. So what's going on, Sharon? You've got a background in education. What's going on in our university sector? What do we need to be reflecting on right now in this moment around these issues?
So, you know, that whole mantra that the personal is political and the political is personal, and around this issue, it feels like that. It's very personal for me, both because I've got a background as an adult educator, but also I've got, as of today, 2 adult children. My youngest child became an adult today. But particularly, so she's in year 12 and she's thinking about what to do next, you know, plans blown up, the gap year holiday overseas next year is not going to happen, so she's thinking about uni. And I've been really dismayed at watching her. I can see her already second guessing what to do because of fees. And we've become such a technocratic society where we don't value the pursuit of knowledge in the hope, you know, hopefully, I don't mean hopefully it'll happen, but we do, you know, that pursuit, that because we pursue knowledge, because we pursue understanding, we hope, because we've seen it before, that new insight, new growth, even new jobs will emerge, but that has to be done out of a place of just deep exploration, not will this degree get me a job. My other daughter's studying social work, which surprisingly does not make you job ready according to the government, and they're hiking the fees on social work. I mean,
I did not know this.
Fees on social work, which is one of the most feminised, underpaid jobs you can get. My children did say to me the other day, why did you train us for jobs that don't earn much? Because my other daughter's thinking about becoming a nurse.
Yeah.
I fear I really do worry about what we're doing about knowledge that's not masculine. Like, I know gender binaries and ways to describe language are problematic, but this notion that we're privileging knowledge that we've traditionally ascribed to the male, you know, engineering, making, fixing, logical problem solving. They're the degrees we're prioritising by and large. And mathematics, I think, is a bit of an exception, because mathematicians will tell you that it's actually a philosophy, not a linear thing. But I'm really intrigued that in a moment where liminality is being pressed on us by a virus, we're rushing to try and privilege things that do not deal well with lineality, that take us back, that we you know, it's like we're denying the state we're in. So let's privilege all those degrees and knowledge and qualifications that are linear, that problem solve, that pretend that this is not a crisis that's forcing us to ask questions about meaning and purpose and who are we and what are we and how do we want to be. Let's get back to that kind of way of thinking. And I do think that someone's just said, my friend Karen's just said, is it a scramble for certainty? And I think it is part. They seem to provide good answers. I mean, we all know, you know, philosophy and history and the arts, they open us up to questions rather than give us answers. And I think we're at a point where that actually is what would really help us emerge from this pandemic well. But we're choosing to go back to, I think, a very old way of, like a way of thinking that's not going to help us. If we've got to go through I think if we've got to go through a pandemic, we should make the most of it.
Mm.
And the most we could make of it is to be a nation that values diversity of knowledge. So I'm,
right.
like, thank goodness for engineers. I'm living in a house that is upright, that isn't going to fall in on me, that stays solid and so on. But it's not the only knowledge, and that's what worries me about this, is it privileges particular knowledge, and it does disadvantage not just women, but I've been really interested following, I follow a lot of women, First Nations women on Twitter, and they are the most outraged about this, because they say they're the kinds of courses that First Nations women in particular,
absolutely,
they get their start. So it's, what voices are we crowding out? And for me, that is really a really key question for something like feminist theology, is to keep noticing what voices are missing, what voices are being systematically dampened down through government policy, through government funding. And I think this crisis in higher education is just making that worse. And I think there's no doubt we're all going to emerge from this a little bit traumatised, a bit anxious, but not just individually, which I think many of us are, but collectively, as a nation, I think as a world. And to punish people who can't complete university is so un-trauma informed.
Yeah.
Breathtaking. Like, I am no expert on trauma, so all those people, I know there's fantastic people in theology doing trauma-informed research. Get writing right now. And as I say, I just know a little bit about trauma-informed responses, and even I can see this is such an un-trauma-informed knee-jerk response.
One of the interesting comments that's popped up from Kath now is about hierarchies, and the whole question of who and what is missing and why. And it's interesting that the very policies that have announced seem to be doubling down on the old Western-centric masculine hierarchies. So the prioritising of certain courses at university that are male-dominated over courses that are non-white male-dominated. And this also in the training sector, so funding that's been released for vocational training, it's not for hairdressers and enrolled nurses. You'll be very shocked to hear it's for male-dominated vocational training courses. So a lot of those social hierarchies in a time of crisis, as Kath is saying, she's wondering if it's due to the anxiety that in our most critical periods, what's happening to the world, everything's crumbling around us, we double down on the status quo and go revert to those hierarchies. Is that right, Kath? You keep talking if I'm not getting this right, but do you think there's a bit of that going on, Sharon?
I do. I think, in liminal spaces, our first instinct is always just to go to reset the status quo as quickly as we can. And it's a natural instinct in all of us, and we shouldn't be ashamed of it. We shouldn't, and we shouldn't judge people for that first instinct. I suppose, though, I'm wanting to say when that continues to be our instinct, then we need to have a critical conversation as church, as a community of feminist theologians, as a nation.
Yeah.
How do we acknowledge our anxiety, name it, own it, talk about it, so that we can respond in ways that are not driven by it unthinkingly and uncritically. And
yeah.
Always the danger with anxiety. It's when we don't when we can't find ways to acknowledge it, when we, when we pretend we're not anxious, when we pretend it's not that bad. All the blame shifting that's going on. It's about, I'll manage my anxiety by making that state premier or that department more responsible than me.
Yeah. I mean, one of the interesting things, when anxiety is held and cared for, is rather than doing what Kath is saying, doubling down on the old normative hierarchical ways, when it's cared for, spoken of, looked in the eye, it can be the opening of wild creativity.
Absolutely.
We could be asking creative questions about our university sector, which incidentally, it's not really saving any money. This is peanuts in terms of a national economy. What would it have been like to go the opposite direction and say, remember when we had free university? Let's go back to that.
I've got a year of that.
You had a year of that. Well, I live off the memory of it. I want to keep talking about some of these systemic issues that are happening in society, and then bring it back to the church a little bit. So we talked about universities. What we know in a
I was just going to say, and I think there's a real question for universities like University of Divinity. Like,
yes,
how do we lead the resistance?
Yeah. For those who are listening in, part of the conversation, the Australian collaborators in feminist theology have a relationship with the University of Divinity in Melbourne, but absolutely a place of theological reflection. How does that respond in this moment to think radically different about this? Yeah. It probably follows on nicely to my next question, because as we were saying, in times of crisis, so much of the status quo doubles down, and many of the policies and changes that are happening right now are disproportionately affecting those people that are always disproportionately affected: women, people of colour, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, people with disabilities, people from the queer community. So we know that and underemployment is severely representing women right now as job losses are occurring. And we know that there's a childcare crisis right now that's potentially been quite mismanaged. All these training ventures, as we talked about it, looking at a future for male-dominant fields. And so, of course, many women have been trying very loud, very hard to raise their voices and ask questions about what does this hold for the future of women in Australia. But I want to be more specific in my question, Sharon, to you then, and ask, how is the church stacking up in all the policies and changes and cutting of resources that are going on? Do we have any idea? How do we need to navigate this? Will the church just be like everywhere else? What are your thoughts?
Our track record would say, by and large, we will be. So just putting that out there. I suspect when still not, well, I mean, I haven't asked our age. So those of us that are from big mainline churches, our churches have either do still run or have legacy, are the legacy parents of big agencies, like community service agencies, who are some of the biggest employers of low paid staff. And that's to do with a whole lot of things that's very systemic, but we have to really be honest about that and double down in our advocacy for our employees. So, you know, I think it puts us in a really interesting relationship where it's, and I see that particularly in aged care, where providers are quite strong advocates, not just for their own need for funding, but really on behalf of their staff. They're actually quite articulate about their staff and their need for better pay and the way in which funding doesn't allow that to happen. But I think that is part of the legacy we have to face, that we employ a lot of personal care workers and nurses who are paid less to work in aged care. Like, a nurse gets less to work in historically, as I've never understood. Well, I do understand it about how we value old people, actually, not just women, but old people. And we have to really be alert to making sure our employment practices are as good as they can and must and should be. And we have to watch what happens in that space. I think that's an important space for those of us, particularly, as I say, who are from historic, what we call mainline, the kind of churches that have been here for a long time and have these sort of networks. I suspect in congregations we're not quite there yet of knowing what's happening. I think we haven't done all the sums and worked out how bad it is, but history suggests that in times of financial crisis, in congregations that have staff, for example, the first person that goes will be the girl in the office, as church councils so often talk about them. You know, it'll be the person in the office, it'll be the youth worker, it'll be the cleaner, it'll be, there's a hierarchy of employment in congregations as well, in churches, and that will come out to play. So, as I say, I think we're not quite there yet, just because I think churches are much slower at sorting out what their finances are and who they can afford. But I suspect that's what will happen, that it'll be the allied workers. Someone said the children and family worker, and yes, they're the kinds of people I had in mind.
I have seen some research before, Sharon, saying in the ministerial roles as well, those on partial placements or partial stipends, 0.4, 0.6, 0.8, will be predominantly women. And there's all sorts of complex familial societal networks around why that is. But I certainly, in my anecdotal evidence, know many women in ministry often hear that's all they could get. That's all that they could, they wanted full time, but it was the 0.6 roles that they were made available to them. Is there more that some of us, those of us who are regular attenders in Christian churches, are involved in the governance and practice of authority in the church? Is there more that we should be doing on those structural levels?
Well, I think if you're a member of a congregation, when it does come, if you're a member of a board, the board of your congregation, or you're a member of your church council or parish council or the vestry or whatever term you use, when you emerge from this, and there will, we're not immune from the hard decisions everybody else has had to make. There will be less money to go around. But I guess I'm inviting us to ask the question about, I want us all to at least critically ask, why is it this person that we're recommending to have their hours cut, or for their contract to be terminated, or for their role not to continue? How does that align with who we want to be and what we've stated as our vision and mission principle? It always amuses me in churches that employ youth workers or children and family workers, where they're often the first to go. Their big tagline is that they want to reach out to children and families, but they always cut first the person that could most help them do that. So part of it's about, how do we help congregations be congruous with who they want to be? And I really invite us all, and this is particularly to my clergy colleagues, like we are at the top of the hierarchy in congregations when it comes to employment. So we have a particular privileged responsibility to ask this question, and to, as much as possible, do the work we can to manage our own anxiety about our own mortgage, our own family, our own well-being, and be bold enough to say, why them and not me? Yeah. That's a really tricky question. Like, who wants to ask to be made unemployed? Nobody. But I think when you've given the privilege of a particular space in an organisation, you then have to ask that question. Those of you that are on boards of community service organisations, it's always really hard to get the figures, but I suspect we need to be asking questions about what's happening to our lowest paid workers. Absolutely. Asking our CEOs and CFOs the dollars, and it's that moment when, it's always tricky on boards, they say, nose in, fingers out, but this is a moment I think boards need to be a bit more hands-on and asking for a bit more information than they often get about who's, give us, we don't want names, but please give us breakdowns of which classes of employees, what percentage of each type of employee are you making redundant? Who's been asked to take lesser hours? What frontline services are we who are the people who won't get the services we previously provided? They're not just operational questions, I don't think. No, they're systemic, structural questions. They're values questions. They're about who we are and who we want to be. Yeah. And, I'm on a board, and I have a fear about some of these questions myself. And the other thing I've realised is that they're also really tricky questions to ask on Zoom when you don't know. I'm fairly new to this board, and I don't know people on the board terribly well. And I find it much harder to ask these questions on Zoom than I would face to face. And that says something about me and my lack of capacity in the online space. But I think that's the other thing we have to watch around what's happening to employment in church spaces is how is the online environment also diminishing good decision making? Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Absolutely. I mean, I think
it doesn't allow for some of the intimacy and the questions that might occur when people are sitting in a space. And you do point to, I think, one of the things I'm picking up, and there's lots of really good comments here. One of them is about, a lot of them are about big systemic structural issues. Kath was making the comment of, well, why do we continue to have this model in churches and ministry of one full-time stipend and then everyone else gets, why couldn't we think more creatively about that? What often doesn't happen well at organisational levels in churches is thinking about structure. So we think it's just a coincidence that it's always the family and child worker that gets let go first, or we think it's just a coincidence, or women just want to be working 0.5 because they're all young mothers apparently.
Where are all these young mothers?
And we don't think about things at that structural level. Again, going back to Claire's earlier comments about reflective practice and taking the time and creating the space to ask the difficult questions, to obtain the data, where the STEM research comes in, very helpful.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Big data, people who can analyse big data are helpful in this space.
Yeah, and Rebecca just made the further comment about the whole, the last Horizons conversation around climate change. We are going to have to radically change how we live. That's how we work, how we live in houses, how our whole social worlds operate. And they're high-level structural questions that eventually, if we'd like for this planet to survive, we're going to have to face up to those questions.
They won't just be answered by people that have studied engineering or science.
Absolutely.
I mean, some of it will be.
Yeah.
That's where all these issues for me really intersect. So what's happening, it can seem like what's happening at university is a world away from what's happening to the personal care attendant, in the aged care home, because many of them are migrants. English is their second, third, fourth language. They might dream of a university education but can't see how they can attain or aspire to it. But when we diminish, it's often been in the university space that questions about justice for personal care attendants or other people has been raised and fleshed out and given, the kind of systematic thinking that's needed to help with structural reform. So we also have to hold all these conversations in tension and together, and not say, well, we can't attend to this and that. And I think there's a bit of that going on as well, where we're so focused on the crisis, it's like, well, we can't think about other things.
Yeah.
We can.
Yeah.
And we must.
As a tertiary educator, one of the things I've always thought my job was just to help myself and others learn how to ask better questions. That's it. Yeah. How do we ask better questions? And on that note, we've got about 10 minutes left. So we've been talking about some of the things that a pandemic is changing and causing us to question across churches, university, the government, for women and for all sorts of bodies. So opening up to all you participants, and the chat's been great, but are there any other issues you'd like to raise or questions that you'd like to throw out there for us to engage a little bit? Certainly, Sharon, while we wait for some questions, I wonder if you go back to the idea of feminist theology itself, what does it have to offer for us in the church, outside the church, in this moment?
I mean, kind of when you, when it's one of the key ways in which you think about the world, you keep forgetting that not everybody does, and how you think about the world's very shaped by it. But for me, I mean, what feminist theology does is it comes out of that liberationist perspective. So it's constantly asking the question about whose voices are marginalised. So, obviously it starts with women's voices, but I think the real growth in feminist theology has been around the intersectional questions. So for me, if I want to be a good feminist theologian, if I want to find it helpful, I have to ask myself how much, so much of my early feminist theology, and still my current feminist theology, has been shaped by white American women. Like they just were doing all the interesting writing when I was at theological college in particular. and it took me a little while to discover womenist theology, and then, you know, to learn about Korean women's theology and African women's theology, womanist theology out of an African rather than African American position. And I think, you know, we've got to, for me, feminist theology keeps asking the question, the power question. Who's being served by this policy? Who's being served by this sermon? Who's being served by these prayers, this way of worshipping? And who's not being served? Like, whose voices are being marginalised? Whose positions being diminished? Who's so absent from this conversation, none of us have even noticed when we're not noticing? How do we keep making spaces? Not that I can, you know, not that I speak for those voices, but that I notice those voices aren't there and get out of the way. And so for me, in this moment, that's what feminist theology, it reminds me constantly. It's like that burr that just keeps saying, Sharon, you know, are the interests of the people that have the most to lose, whose voices are most marginalised, are they being served by this conversation, by the work I do, by the government policies? And I think that's what that's what feminist theology did for me. It gave me confidence in my own capacity as a theologian. It made me understand that positionality and context is everything. It shapes so much of how we respond, and nobody comes to a conversation without that. And I think, you know, that is one of the great dangers. Like, I really, you know, political discourse, I mean, not academic political discourse, but, you know, the back and forward of Q&A and live news streams of Daniel Andrews looking haggard for 52 days in a row, and Twitter and so on. There's very little conversation about these things, you know, and that's the kind of conversation we need to have as a matter of course in everyday political discourse, not just academic political discourse about political science, but, you know, to bring those really key questions that feminist theology, I think for me at least, does, which is, I have a right to a voice, but so does everybody else. And we test our voices, we test our theology against the benchmarks of, is this serving the needs of those who are most, who have the most need, or is it reinforcing the most privileged? And that's what I constantly think it does for me. You know, and we even have to ask, as someone said, that kind of someone said we're lifting up God's skirt, but, you know, they're questions we have to ask of our most cherished beliefs. But it means that you're never static as well. For me, that's the thing about feminist theology. I've never arrived. Yeah.
I mean, it does, I think it connects with a number of the questions about I'm going back to Kath about the intersection of prejudice and discrimination. I mean, one of the things about feminist theology, I think, is it provides a tool, a hermeneutic of suspicion or analytical skills of interrogation. And often that's directed at patriarchy in the most general sense. But I think what those of us who are white cis women engaged in academia with jobs and lots of privilege have to learn is to be constantly engaged in that own hermeneutic with ourselves, that own hermeneutic of suspicion, and interrogating our own discourses of whiteness or heteronormativity or ableism, or however it is that we assumed for a while, white feminist theology, that we were speaking for all women, and then we discovered, lo and behold, there's all sorts of privilege that we carry. And one practical thing, just to respond to a number of those questions, that I think is so obvious and so rare, is in terms of the discipline of what you're reading and writing. And I mean, this one seems so obvious, but so many people say they care about things like racism or feminism or being inclusive to the queer community, but they're not engaged in doing the work of reading and learning from the scholars from those areas. And you're not going to learn the analytical skills society needs right now from memes or whatever gets retweeted. We have to dive into the texts of these discourses and struggle with them, and we will not be ready-made experts. And that's the kind of work and struggle that's required of us to actually engage the issues. And I feel like that's a really obvious one that's so often missed. So we'll save all our tough reading to the white philosophers,
Yes.
and then our theories of queer inclusion come from memes on the internet.
Yeah. I agree. Having said that, one of the real joys for me on Twitter is the number of First Nations women I've been able to follow, and I just didn't know they existed till I got on Twitter, and I started following one or two, and then they comment, and that's been, but you're right, you can't stop there. What it's done is open me up to seeing who they are and then tracking down their work.
Yeah.
A lot of them are academics. Actually, it's really interesting how many First Nations women academics are on Twitter trying to get their work noticed and seen, and also trying to take their work and talk into what they call, they use the word mob their people, like to talk to people who don't get, who have nurtured them, so people who have a lot of cultural knowledge but not academic knowledge, and have that conversation. And it's really I think that's a really interesting space, but you do have to do the hard work of tracking down their work and reading it properly, not just 180 characters. Like that, for me, that's the gateway.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the doorway. Yeah. Oh, who should we follow? Oh gosh, so many.
Yeah, and maybe we could add, I've written lists before, book reading lists, so maybe we could put together some other resources to be sent out. I'm not on Twitter. I'm a Luddite in that regard, so maybe Sharon can.
I'll put a list up and we can email it round of some of the First Nations women. Well, the ones I like anyway. By like, I mean I get provoked by, in a good way.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's, don't get me wrong, there's lots of high-level, rapid-moving, sharp thinking that happens in social media. I'm not dismissing that at all. I just think what often happens is people say, I really care about these issues. I like a click and I share, but when it comes to my study time, I stick to the canon of white Anglicanism or whatever it is, and I don't actually struggle with any of this. And partly because it exposes us to a discourse that's not for us and that we don't have immediate access to. So it's unfamiliar to us. It's not a white European discourse sometimes. It's not immediately, we have to struggle our way in. And I think that's the kind of work that's required of us.
And you're being told constantly, actually, you have to sit on the edge.
Yeah.
Like, that's the interesting thing when you follow First Nations people. They basically frequently say white people don't comment.
Yeah, and imagine the horror. But I have many profound thoughts. What do you mean? You want me to be sensitive?
You can never be an expert on Indigenous knowledge.
Right, absolutely.
And that's confronting. Like you go, what? What?
Yeah.
You don't want to hear from me?
Yeah. And on that note, maybe, Sharon, that we've said enough then.
Maybe we have.
It has been such a pleasure to gather with you all just some of the issues that are facing women and all sorts of marginalised communities in this time. I guess the big takeaway is that we have to keep thinking, and we have to keep thinking together and provoking the kind of interrogations of what is happening right now, what is happening to women, and what kind of future is opening up or closing down in front of our eyes in the moment of crisis. So we're so glad that you could be with us today. We will be sending out an email. We've got a list of some resources on the topics of conversation we were talking about, but we'll look to get some Twitter recommendations and perhaps some in more feminist theology or critical theory reading lists to be sent out for those who are interested.
That'd be good.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you all.
Pleasure. Thank you, everyone.